Thank you for still being here and listening to us. It's the last intervention of the day. So let me briefly introduce you to Chao Tayiana Maina. She is a historian, but also works in computer science. And she made a photographic project about the railways in her country, into the Kenya. She wanted to document the railways right before its destruction. So Chao, you also made different other projects, and I would like to come back to this need of documenting the railways, knowing that it might be a controversial topic, you know, like the railways have been built by the colonizer into the Kenya, and you now as a young black and also, I wouldn't say activist, but like you also work on decolonial matters into your country. How comes that you wanted to document this, the train and the whole situation? That's the first question.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone who's here. I think I'm the luckiest girl in the world because I get to be the last person to present on both days. But it's really a pleasure to everyone who has stayed on. When I started documenting the railway, to be honest, the motivation for it was that Kenya was at a crossroads. We had a new railway coming in that was being funded by the Chinese government. And I felt that I was living in a very small town that had this railway station at the center of it. And the railway station was falling apart, and there was a new railway station coming in. And so I thought it would be good to document this station. And after I did so, I realized that many other stations in the country were falling apart in the same way. And so I decided, okay, I started with one, let me do two, and before I knew it, it was 50 plus stations. But what is interesting, as you mentioned, that the railway in itself has many meanings and many memories and many kind of contestations in its life, representing, as we've had over and over again today, both violence, both promise, you know, and I was trying to capture what it meant to Kenyans, to Africans in particular, because I felt strongly that the histories we had growing up in school over and over again were histories about the railway as it related to Europeans. And I wanted to capture what it meant to Kenyans and Africans as a whole, yeah.
And if I understood well, I think it's really during the process of working, yeah.
Oh, how do I change? Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
It's really like when you started your project, you wanted to document the railways, and it's really when you started your project that you started to have conversation with the people, that you really realized how important it was for the people, and that you started to also document this. Is it also at this time that you started to work on digitalization and that you started to think maybe about digitalizing the African heritage, or is it later? How did this process started?
At the time that I was doing this project, I had virtually no training in like historical inquiry. I was not actually perceiving myself as a historian. I was thinking of myself more as a hobbyist, as an enthusiast who just has a camera. But for me, I think the inspiration came after I did the project and after I saw what it meant for people to have a space. And I think we really underestimate that, what it means to create a space for people to have dialogue. Yeah? Because it's a very different thing when you invite people to see something and then leave, but there's also the perspective of inviting people to view something and then contribute. And I was using online spaces, digital spaces, particularly to invite people to share. And so when I saw the kind of dialogue it was generating, I mean, I would get emails from Kenyans living in Australia, in Canada, in Eldoret, in Kisumu, and people would even send me their personal photographs in their family album saying, this is me on the train when I was on my honeymoon in the 1970s. Now you have to imagine this is a stranger we have never met. They probably don't know if I'm an imposter or not. But the very fact that this kind of project or documentation has moved someone enough to react in that way, I started thinking, okay, this digitization kind of documentation thing, it has potential in various ways. And to see Kenyans of my generation also who had not really seen themselves as people who could participate in history. It was always for others or older people. And it was interesting, yeah. So it came after the need or the perspective to digitize things as a career came after this project. But I would say it was because of this project.
Okay. I think what the Professor Dibre said this morning was really important about, the part like maybe you have a different period, like the death, the life, and then again the death. I would like you to maybe go across your pictures here and to briefly comment them now. Where is the...
Oh, I have.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I have it here. So I think this photograph in particular is interesting because you will notice the debris around the station. This is the kind of signaling cabin, but the main station building itself had already been demolished by the time this photograph was taken. And I think to me it really represents this idea of life and death coexisting side by side, because you have this cabin and you have the people around sitting by, but you can also see that the other station has been demolished. And so this was an interesting point to capture, like Kenya being, we're going this way, but this is where we have come from. Yeah, in a way.
And this one?
This is in Mombasa, which is the port town, and was the first station along the railway line by the coast. At that time, it was still being used for passenger trains, I think once a week, but people would just come to the station to relax, per se. So if you didn't have anywhere to go or you wanted a place to just rest, regardless of whether you were using the train or not, people would use the station for that. So it wasn't really functional as a station, but more as either a meeting point or a place for people to just converse and have dialogue, etc.
And how long did you take to really document? How long did you work on this project? It was for 2 years?
Close to 4 years. But that was just because I was a student at the time and I was doing this on the side. So I had to do it in between breaks and with kind of restraints on resources as well. This photo I like as well. This is in Rift Valley. This is Nairobi railway station, which was very functional at the point. At that point, Nairobi railway station is still very active. And this was Miss Mary, the station master. I think this is one of my favorite photos from the series because I was just having a conversation with her and she had left to go and pick up something. But just capturing her, and also it's very rare to have like a female station master. She's the only person that I met in a city such as Nairobi, and I thought this was kind of representative. You can see the colonial architecture, but at the same time, she represents something that is different from this space as well.
You also said that now you started to work on documenting infrastructures that were also where people were being captive during the colonization, during the British colonization. Would you like to say something about this project that is also very important?
So Save the Railway, or the railway project in itself gave birth to another project. At the moment, I am documenting detention camps that was set up by the colonial government in the 1950s to 1960s. What you can see is young men being ferried or led into a train to be taken to detention camps their crime, or what they were accused of, is being part of the Mau Mau, which was the freedom fighting movement. I started to document these sites of detention because after Kenya's independence, they disappear in terms of national memory. They're either turned into schools or prisons, but we don't really learn about them in school. And the scale of detention, we're talking about maybe 100 or so camps spread out across Kenya. At the height of detention, it is estimated that there were 80,000 people in detention camps, with 150,000 people passing through all these detention camps in close to around 7-8 years. So you can see this is not a small program. And so this is a building that was used as a mass cell to hold detainees, but it's now being used as a classroom in its exact form. It is a classroom. And you can still see the barbed wire on the roof, used to prevent detainees from escaping. And it is used as a classroom with the barbed wire still in place. And so I've been going around the country documenting these sites, mapping them, and also creating a way for Kenyans to access them. Because one, the archives are in the UK, so you can't just walk into Nairobi National Archives and access them. And two, as I mentioned, we really don't have any visual references for the camps in our kind of public schools, etc. So we work with students from the architectural department at the University of Nairobi to come up with small models that people can see and interact with. And it's a very different way of interacting with history that I never had the chance to do or to interact with this way in school. What we're also doing, and this is one of my specializations, is creating visualizations based on these camps. So this is an archival photo. You can see the entrance to the camp with a watchtower. And we are creating open access 3D visualizations that people can use in films, in research, educational research, etc. So the project is maybe 2-3 years in the running, but it still very much follows the kind of railway work of documenting through photography while having a very strong component of oral history and interviewing people as well. Yeah.
And when you say detention camps, like, why don't you say prison? Like, what is the difference? What were happening actually into those camps?
That's a good question. They were camps of detention because it was perceived that people were suspected of being in the Mau Mau, so they couldn't prove that you are a freedom fighter. And if you were suspected to be a freedom fighter in itself, or as they called it, a terrorist, then you would go through a system of camps. So you wouldn't just spend time in one camp. You would go through a system of camps until you confessed or renounced the Mau Mau. And so you would move from camp to camp to camp to camp. The people who spent almost 8 years moving from camp to camp because they refused to renounce. And so it was set up as a system of rehabilitation, quote unquote, but to make you confess, some of the techniques that were used were forced labor, torture, dilution techniques, very many atrocities that took place in these camps. And so they were called detention camps, essentially, but very much modeled in the style of concentration camps. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and we are running out of time, but let me ask you a very last question, because I know you're specialized into digitalization, and you also work on documenting the African heritage, but I know you also work on questions of restitutions. Just to let it know to the public, it's definitely not a topic that we will address today, but at least I wanted the people to know that they can research you, look at your website, that there are very interesting information about it, and maybe in the future we can talk about this topic, and why not here, because that's the place to do it. So. I don't know if the public, someone in the audience would like to ask a question.
So these visualizations and these models, I mean, what is your experience with that? So did people really, did you have the feeling that it really worked to have a much bigger engagement of the audience? And is there then a difference between the models and the 3D visualizations?
So our approach to using the models and the 3D visualizations was motivated also by the fact that a lot of these archives have copyright restrictions, which to me is unethical. But at the same time, if I wanted to use an image of a camp, for example, I would either have to pay the Getty Institute $400 to use, so the use restrictions for us were a major kind of way of exploring how can we work around this. In the times that we have shown the models, the response has been very interesting because many Kenyans do not even have a visual reference for what these camps look like. The first time I showed, my great-grandmother was in one of these camps, and the first time I showed my grandfather a picture of the camps, his reaction was so visceral, and it made me realize that this was the first time in his life, at 70 or 80 years old, he was seeing a visual reference of where his mother was held in 7 years. And so we are working kind of with the power of visual references to explain something that has heavily been talked about mostly in academic circles, written in English. And so even the access barrier for most Kenyans is quite high to get to this point of understanding what the camps were. And the kind of tactile models have been the most kind of engaging with people, just to see people work around them, stand around them in a way that we are not used to interacting with history in this way. And I should also mention that the camps that still exist are mostly private property or schools. So I can know that there's a camp, for example, next door, but I can't just walk in and say, I want to see it. And so the visuals in themselves are helping to kind of jump through all these barriers. We hope to create more, but the kind of reactions that we've had have been very interesting, in the least.
Can I ask another one? Sorry, I mean, you came all the way, so we really need to profit from your expertise. No, because I mean, we showed the cover of a book, Ukumbusu, which was an exhibition that Mémoire de Lubumbashi did. And for me, so that was my first trip to Congo, and that was at the moment of that exhibition. It was basically having inhabitants of Lubumbashi bring personal objects to the museums and having personal stories attached to that. Is that something that you think would be something that would be possible in this?
In terms of people bringing in their material?
But because, I mean, you have the materiality of the detention camp, but what about everyday life in it? Is there like an other way of are there like artifacts or sounds, or I mean songs, or I mean I'm thinking of this discussion of the different sources that we have. So is there like another way of entering into this very interesting field of?
Good question. We are actually carrying out oral history interviews alongside these visualizations and documentations. So one of the camps, for instance, I don't know how to go back. It's like a metaphor for life. Huh? Oh. Yeah. So in this camp, for instance, we found veterans who were actually detained here, and we recorded their stories. What I hope and I wish that we can do even in future, when we have resources, is to really contextualize the kind of material space with the intangible histories, perspectives, and memories that are associated with it, because we have 3 different kinds of data sets. Yeah, you have the structures in themselves, which are a testament to a particular thing. We have the oral history, which is the people who were actually detained here, what they went through, what they had to do on a day-to-day basis. when they were released. So, for example, all the bricks that you see in this building were actually made by the detainees themselves. So they would make the bricks and actually take part in the construction of the camps that they were being held in. And then you have the archives, which are either in the UK or in the Kenya National Archives, with details such as this is what a camp looked like, these are the activities from a colonial administrator's perspective. And so what we're trying to do is mesh these different things alongside, for example, the perspective of the student who has to learn in this classroom as we speak, you know, which is also cutting through time and bringing all these perspectives that we usually consider linear in like a more circular, cyclic kind of perspective. Yeah. Okay.
More questions?
Okay.
I cannot imagine that there are no questions. I mean, but maybe
tired.
everybody is really that tired.
Yeah.
We should call it a day.
We should.
So there is like closing statements. I mean, it could be very brief. And do you want to sit in with the closing statements?
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, we'll do it in 5 minutes.
Within 5 minutes. Okay, can I do it in French? Yeah, okay. J'ai déjà mon micro. Pour moi, la journée a été vraiment hyper enrichissante. Cette thématique du train, au départ, je trouvais ça quelque peu surprenant, hein, quand c'est vrai, quand EUROPALIA, l'équipe d'EUROPALIA m'a contactée pour me parler de cette question du train. J'étais assez surprise et hésitante, mais en fait, c'est une thématique qui est vraiment très très riche. Qui parle de la vie des gens, qui parle de la vie des infrastructures, qui parle aussi des responsabilités du présent. Moi, ce qui m'a le plus intéressée, c'était, et qui n'a pas forcément été beaucoup abordé, en tout cas pas en détail ici aujourd'hui, c'était la question de la destruction de l'environnement. Parce que ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on ne réalise pas quand aujourd'hui le train est présenté comme quelque chose, comme un moyen de déplacement écologique et positif. Et donc, que ce soit même en Europe, on a déplacé des populations, on a détruit la nature, on a changé tous des écosystèmes pour pouvoir construire ce moyen de déplacement. Et donc, voilà, dans toutes les interventions qu'il y a eu aujourd'hui, voilà, j'ai appris vraiment beaucoup de choses sur le continent, sur l'Afrique, et c'était assez fascinant. And I thank you very much for coming here all the way from Kenya to tell us about your project in Nairobi. Thank you very much. Voilà.
So basically what I would like to do is just start from the questions that were at the heart of this project. I'm not going to give a response, I'm just going to articulate what Robbie and me probably were the questions. So for me, the railway lines in Africa are a very good tool to go beyond what I would say very often still is the dominating trope of looking at Africa from a nationalist perspective, meaning that we see this continent as something that has been divided through the scramble of Africa into different separate colonial territories, which then became independent nations. And I think the railroads really force us to think across borders and to see much more connectivity. And I think that's really, for me, that was really a key point for this EUROPALIA Arts Festival project, that we would bring that to the table. So I'm not going to give a response, so I'm just going to say, okay, this was like an entry point. So can we basically use the railroads to talk about a much more connected history, but also a connected present and even connected future of the continent? That's the first point. The second point is basically that the dominant trope, if you talk about railway lines, is that, and we've heard it a couple of times, it's of course instruments of extractive capitalism, both in the past and in the present. And we've heard today very often, and I think rightly so, that it's a history of violence. So it's a history of violence in terms of the construction of these infrastructures. It's a history of violence in the landscape, so the ecological kind of devastation that went through it. So the Lagae Alliance is a very good entry point, I think, to look at that radical transformation of landscapes and a new spatial order basically being implemented on what was described as a terra nullius, but was of course not. There was something there. And so it was devastated by this new infrastructure. It's a history of violence in terms of, if you think of the black bodies that were moved, so if you think of the laborers that were moved on the train. So again, I'm going to make a plea for everyone to read Charles van Onselen's book, The Night Trains, which is really a devastating account of what that means in an everyday life and in an everyday regime of moving laborers from the southern part of Mozambique to the mining compounds of Johannesburg. So that's, you could say very rightly so, that we acknowledge that history of violence. I think for me, the whole project was also about, can we bring alternative questions to the table and alternative perspectives, in the sense that, and I think the quote has been repeated a couple of times, is a railway line bringing death, or can it also bring life? And are life and death actually disconnected, or are they like really entangled? And I think for me, one of the highlights was actually the question of Donatien Dubuis and then the response of Aymar to that. So I think that was a very important moment in the day for me, at least. And then, so can we see actually the railway lines not only also as today as failed infrastructure, which is also a very dominant trope, but are there like other ways of looking at that infrastructure that is still there? And then the last thing for me, which was a bit why we brought together a wide array of people from very different disciplines, backgrounds, and also having this stage, a kind of conversation between scholars and artists. So what are the sources, what are the methods, what are the analytical tools that we need to look at these railway lines and really see them as something that can really help us rethink the African continent. So for me, those were like entry points into this project. I know what my answers to to what this day has brought has been, but I think it's up to you to decide if these entry points really made a difference for you or not. And that's basically the last thing that I want to say. So I don't know if somebody from this museum is here, but basically Eva already thanked a whole bunch of people. I really would like to thank the museum for hosting this, and I really would like the people who are over there who did actually a brilliant job of, because hybrid formats are extremely difficult. I'm not a big fan of hybrid format conferences, and I must confess this is one that succeeded very well. So for my part, a job really well done, both from the team of the audio and the online. So really great thanks for that. And thanks to, again, Eva and Dirk for making this possible and doing this adventure together.